At Luke, the 15th chapter, and we're glad for you to open your Bibles and turn over there with us. In the selection of parables or selection of favorite verses, I think the 15th chapter of Luke is one of those that are listed as one of those favorites. And many times people ask the question, why did Jesus speak in parables? Why did he just straight out tell us exactly what he wanted us to know without the telling stories? And there are a number of reasons. Parables are very easy to remember. You tell a story, and people remember it without even taking notes. They can remember most of the story that they've heard, and it will stay in their minds even when they don't understand it. They'll remember the story, and maybe later on they will remember what was said and say, "Oh, now I know. Now I understand." Or perhaps it is because Jesus said in Matthew the 13th chapter, I'm speaking to you in parables. In answer to the question, why are you speaking in parables? He said, because those who are spiritually minded can understand what I'm saying, and those who are not spiritually minded are not intended to understand. He quoted from Isaiah the 6th chapter, where God commissioned Isaiah to go and tell them what God's message was for them, that they were sinners and they're lost, and God's going to drive them out of the country in which they were living, and they were going into captivity. But God said to Isaiah, you will not find people who will listen to you. They have ears to hear, but they will not hear. They have eyes to see, but they will not see. They have hearts to understand, but they will not understand. That's a very disheartening thing to tell a preacher, as the Lord says, go preach for the rest of your life, and for the next number of years that you're preaching, nobody's going to pay any attention to you. And the fact is, Jesus spoke in parables because he intended that those who are spiritually minded would understand, and those who are not would not understand. In this series of studies, I may have to have help with this, putting on that first verse. There we go. That's not it. There you go. We're talking in Luke, the 15th chapter, about some stories concerning those who are lost. These stories concerning those who are lost starts off with chapter 15, talking about the situation or the context in which these stories are told. This is a passage that was read by Brother Grant. He said, now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. First thing I would point out is the fact that the word parable is a singular word. Oftentimes I have in times past preached upon these parables of Jesus and pointing out, well, here's a parable of the lost sheep. The next is the parable of the lost coin. And the next is the parable of the lost son. 3 parables. But somehow or other, the inspired writer says this is the parable, singular, and then teaches them these 3 consecutive stories. It might be that the Lord intended for all of these stories to be one parable, and that all of them are to be studied at the same time. I have never done that before. My habit was to simply separate these as different parables, and much as most preachers do, they'll take a parable at a time and go through the story and make every part of the story amount to something. They'll say this means this and this means that, and that's not wrong. It's just that today I want us to look at all of these stories together. I'm not going to spend all the time talking about the stories. I want to talk about the context, that context in which we find these stories, the situation, why these stories were told, and the very point that Jesus had in mind when he was telling the stories. I was told when I first started preaching, the very first thing that you consider is context, context, context. If you don't get that down, you've missed the point. Well, the context here is that Jesus was teaching. And as he was teaching, in the first year of his teaching, he gradually gained great popularity with the common people. And he became a celebrity of sorts, so that during the second year, oftentimes the scribes and the Pharisees would invite him to a dinner. They wanted this celebrity to have dinner with them. And it didn't always go too well, because they would find fault with Jesus, and Jesus then would explain things to them that they didn't like to hear. During the third year of his ministry, which we usually say this 15th chapter of the book of Luke may be found in that time period, when Jesus was even talking to people, and a great crowd of people would follow him, and he was very popular among those who were the sinners and realized they were sinners. Those Jews who had become puppets of the Roman government in collecting the taxes from their own people, they were not very popular. They were the publicans, the tax collectors. And then those who were outright recognized to be sinners. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were the righteous. And I'm saying that in a peculiar way because that's what they considered themselves more than anything. They were righteous in the max degree as far as they were concerned. These people are talked about in the book of the Lord a number of times. There were good people who were Pharisees. Nicodemus was a good man, the one who came to Jesus by night and wanting to know more about what he was teaching, and the one who got his body from the cross and took it down and buried it in his own tomb. Another man who turned out to be a righteous man we know as the Apostle Paul. So there were men who became righteous men who had been Pharisees. But the Pharisees as a whole did not find great favor with the Lord. I find over here in Matthew the 15th chapter, and when Jesus was teaching, when he came to this world to teach, his primary mission was not to teach just everybody in all of the world. He was not going into all the world preaching the gospel to every creature. His mission upon the earth was to teach the lost sheep of the tribes of Israel. And one of the reasons that he was so popular among the regular folk was the fact that most of them realized that they were not on the upper rungs of society. That would be the Sadducees. Nor even were among the popular middle class folks. That was the Pharisees. But they were of the lower class folks. And if they considered anything, they were impressed with the fact that others considered them the lower class people. And they were considered not worthy of consideration by those who were the Sadducees, nor worthy of consideration by those who were the Pharisees. Pharisees hated the Gentiles, but that was not the only class they hated. They hated everybody that was not of their own class. They were super haters. And they looked down upon everyone else. They did not like those who were of the lost sheep of the tribes of Israel. But those are the ones to whom Jesus came in his personal ministry. We find in Matthew the 15th chapter how that a Canaanite woman from the region of Tyre and Sidon came to him one day and said, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her. She cried out again and again. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away. She's crying out after us." And Jesus answered, primarily for the Canaanite woman's benefit, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now this lost sheep of the tribe of the house of Israel was also the group to whom John the Baptist, his forerunner, had come teaching. John the Baptist was not just preaching to the world. John the Baptist was preaching specifically to the lost sheep of the tribes of Israel. And we find there in Matthew the 10th chapter, verses 5 through 7, when Jesus sent out his disciples on that limited commission. The 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Jesus taught concerning the false shepherds of his day. And those were the Pharisees. the false shepherds of his day. When Jesus taught the Pharisees directly, these are the kinds of words that he used. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! And this was stated over and over again. Matthew 23 and verse 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you shut off the kingdom of God from people, you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you devour widows' houses, for a pretense you make long prayers, therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because you travel around sea and land to make one proselyte. When he becomes a proselyte of yours, he becomes twice the son of hell that you are. Woe to you, scribes and woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. Whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated to keep his oath. You fools and blind men. He says in verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin. Those are the smallest seeds imaginable. And you have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. They were so bad that Jesus said, upon you is going to come all of the blood of all of the martyrs that have ever lived on the face of the earth, from Abel up until this day. That's how bad they were. Now, we can say those were the people during Jesus' day, and that's true. But those are the kind of people we don't want to be like. Isn't that true? We do not want to be scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. We want to be more like Jesus, who gives us the example of the kind of person we should become and want to become. Jesus is our shepherd, and he's the true shepherd. And he's the one who gathers together those who have fallen and those who have gone astray. Now, the word lost is a terrible, terrible word. In this chapter, it's repeated several times in these stories that are told. But I want us to be very careful not to get the wrong idea as we're going through these parables. Notice in the first parable, the very first part, he says, I'm going to tell you this parable. Who is he speaking to? Here he is speaking to the Pharisees and the scribes who were grumbling, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. He's telling whom? He's telling the scribes and Pharisees, those whom he condemns as hypocrites. This is the story for them. And then he uses the unusual language, what man among you? What man among you? If he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, would not do this. Who is he proposing should act as the shepherd? Who is he suggesting should picture themselves in the position of the shepherd who had 100 sheep? Picture yourself in this scene. He's talking to the scribes and Pharisees. You picture yourself in this scene where you have 100 sheep and one of them goes astray. Wouldn't you go out and look for that one sheep? Who is he suggesting is the shepherd in this case? In context, he's suggesting those scribes and Pharisees put themselves in the position of this shepherd who has 100 sheep, loses one, and now what do? Well, he goes out and looks for the sheep till he finds it, brings it back, and he announces to all of his neighbors, come and rejoice with me. My sheep was lost and it's found. And he would have a great feast to celebrate the finding of the one sheep. And then he draws the conclusion, even so, it is just like this. that there is rejoicing in heaven over one sinner that repents. He tells another story, and the story is there in Luke, the 15th chapter, and he says, or what woman, if she has 10 silver coins, loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, search carefully till she finds it. When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors and says, rejoice with me, for I have found the coin which I have lost. In the same way, Jesus is making application then to the Pharisees. He's talking to the Pharisees. In the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repents. Now, a sheep in Jesus' parable, in Jesus' story, the sheep is not a Christian who's lost. The sheep is a sheep, a thing, not a human being. And he's saying to these Pharisees, even if you lost a sheep, a possession, an animal that you've lost, you would go out and look for it and seek until you find it. And when you found it, you'd bring it back home and ask your neighbors, rejoice with me, my sheep was lost, I found it. The woman lost a coin. The coin does not stand for something else. It stands for a coin. And he's saying to these Pharisees, just picture the woman who's lost a coin. She's lost a coin. Now, a coin is not a person. A coin is money. If you lost money, and the Pharisees were lovers of money, they would look for it, sweeping a whole house until they found that coin. They're picturing themselves as the woman who lost the coin. And when she found the coin, what would she do? She'd bring it back home and she would tell her neighbors, I lost the coin, I found the coin that I lost, I want you to rejoice with me, be glad. And the application is, in the same way I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. It's important, I think, for us to understand he's setting the stage in the first two. He's asking the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, who had possessions that they valued highly, and they got excited if they lost something of value to them, a possession. But the real story is the third story. He's setting the stage. He's gotten them to agree with him on the first two stories. A man had 2 sons. Now, a son is not the same as a sheep. A son is not the same as a coin. The father had 2 sons. He tells them the story. I won't go into all the story. You know the story. The younger son wanted his inheritance. What would fall to him someday? When the father had died, he would have an inheritance. The son came to his father and said, give me my inheritance now. I want my inheritance now. He's saying, in essence, I wish you were dead. I want to leave. I want to go out on my own. I don't want to be under my father's house anymore. He was rebellious. He wanted to leave the family. He wanted to leave the area. He wanted to leave his father's house. He wanted to leave all of that country. He wanted to go into a far country and have a great time on his own. And eventually he did. When he was in a foreign country, he wasted his country. He wasted his substance in riotous living. And when he had lost everything he had, a famine hit the land. There was terrible times. He became hungry. He hired out to a man, and this man he hired out to was not a Jew. He was a Gentile. Hired out to this Gentile in order to feed pigs, take care of them. And he would have filled his own stomach with the pods that the pigs ate because he was that hungry. His stomach couldn't digest that kind of thing. But he envied the pigs the food they ate. He was in bad shape. He was a wastrel. He wasted. He was a prodigal. He wasted. And when he found himself in that situation, taking care of the pigs and covered with the slop, he would eat the slop the pigs ate, and he was covered in the mud that the pigs made. He came to himself. He came to himself and thought things through. He said, in my Father's house even the hired servants have enough to eat. I will arise and go to my Father, and I will say, Father, I've sinned against thee and against heaven. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Let me be as a hired servant. Let me come back home. And he arose and he went. And the scriptures speak about that. I need to talk more about the Pharisees. He told the parable of some who trusted in themselves they were righteous, treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One man was a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee prayed thus. It's interesting, the King James translation anyway says, he prayed thus with himself. He prayed this prayer with himself. So, Father, I thank thee that I'm not like other men are, not like that one over there, that tax collector. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And contrast that with the tax collector who would not so much as lift his eyes unto heaven, but smote himself upon the breast and said, O God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In fact, the actual word, be merciful unto me, the sinner. And Jesus said, this man, this tax collector, he didn't say he went down to his house justified just like the righteous man or just like the Pharisee. He said, this man who humbled himself before God and cast himself upon God's mercy went down to his house justified rather than the Pharisee, rather than the other. But now let's get back to where we were. I can catch up. The Pharisees cared a lot about a lost sheep and a lost coin, and Jesus was making a point that would make them agree with him on those two things. He said, what man among you? He's talking to the Pharisees. He's getting them to agree with him. Then he talked about the lost son. The young man came to himself, repented, and returned. He arose and came to his father while he was still a long way off. His father, looking down the lane, could see a little spot out there that looked like a person coming. And he didn't wait. He ran down that road. It suggests that father had been looking down that road more than once, perhaps every day that the young man had been gone. And he saw someone that looked like his son. And he ran down that road. And that was something that a man of his stature, his position in community, his age, would not be running. But he ran down that road. And he went and got to his son. And his son, Father, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. And the father would not wait for him to finish his speech. He threw his arms around him. And he kissed him. And he said to his servants, bring the best robe, put it upon him. He put a ring upon his finger. He said, put shoes on his feet. This my son was dead and is alive. This my son was lost and he's found. Kill the fattened calf and let us celebrate. He was lost and he's found. He was dead and he's alive. And so they were having the celebration in the house. When the older son returned from the field, having been working in the field. And it says, As he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. He heard loud celebration going on. He called a servant and said, "What's going on? What's happening here?" And he said to him, "Your brother has come. Your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound." But the older son became so angry he could hardly see it. He was not happy that his younger brother had returned. He refused to go in to participate in the celebration. And perhaps one of the servants told the father, "He's outside." So the father came out to him and entreated him. Entreated means he begged him. He said, "This is what you need to do. You need to come in and participate in the celebration." "Why?" the young man said. He answered his father, "Look, not my father. Not listen to my side of it." It's as if he poked his finger in his chest and said, "Look here, old man. These many years I have served you, and I had never disobeyed your command. You never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." He said to him, "Son, you're always with me." He called him my son. "You're always with me. All that is mine is yours." It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. It was fitting means it was necessary. It was the right thing to do. There's no other way we could have expressed to you and to the people around us and to our son. It was the right thing to do, to celebrate and express the fact that we are glad that he's back. This your brother was dead. He's alive. He was lost and is found. How does the story end? On this page, it ends right there. In the Bible, it ends right there. He was lost and is found. The older son was so angry he could not see straight. Who does the older brother represent? If we say, well, the father represents the Father in heaven. The younger son represents those Jews who had wandered away and become sinners. And Jesus wants them to know God wants you to come back home. And your Father will receive you back. The older son represents whom? Who is Jesus talking to in this whole series of stories? He's talking to the Pharisees. The Pharisees who became angry because Jesus was eating and associating himself with sinners. What's the point of the whole story? Well, Jesus' point was talking to the Pharisee. What's the point of the story as far as you and I are concerned? I think if we overlook this, we're overlooking the main point of the whole story. We identify ourselves with some in this story. I'm not sure how you identify yourself in this story. Many of us identify ourselves as that son that wandered away and came back home. And that's God's forgiveness. But some may identify themselves as those who are angry at those sinners who think they can get by with anything, and they think they can come back and ask God's forgiveness and they'll just take care of everything. And we identify with the older brother. That's the Pharisee. That's the Pharisee Jesus is talking about. So either we identify ourselves with the Pharisee, or may I point out another way we can identify ourselves? We can identify ourselves with Christ, who's telling the story. And we know that Christ's mission in this point of his life was to seek and to save those who were lost. And the Lord has sent us forth to go into all of the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And the Lord wants us to have compassion upon the lost today, just like he had compassion upon the lost then. And just as he had a passion for the lost, he had such a desire for the lost to be saved that he's willing to sacrifice his own life to that end. He wants the lost to be saved. He wants you and me to be saved. Now, we can identify ourselves with Christ, and that's what we ought to do. Or we can identify ourselves with the older brother, with the Pharisees of his day, who considered themselves so very righteous and untouchable that they were above everyone else and didn't want to be messing with those sinners, those poor sinners. I know who I want to identify myself with. And I don't want to be a Pharisee. But I can tell you, to the extent that you identify yourself with Christ, you will indeed seek and save the lost. And you'll be identified by what you do, whether you're identified with Christ in seeking and saving the lost, or turning up your nosing at those people out there who are sinners, that we don't want them to come in and taint the congregation and soil our group. I'm sure you don't feel that way. But you see what I'm saying? We identify ourselves with Christ or with a Pharisee. Which is it? And that's, I think, the point of the whole story. We identify ourselves with Christ, who is seeking to save the lost, whom he has great compassion upon, or we identify ourselves with a Pharisee and could care less where they're lost. We don't feel that way, do we? We want to save the lost. We don't want to turn our back upon those who are lost, the next door neighbor or the friend or someone we're working with, someone we could tell the gospel to. We don't want them to be lost if we share the same attitude that Christ had. The Pharisee would say, let them go their own way. I'm busy with my own things. Let them be lost. I think that's what the parable is all about. I ask you to consider it. This evening, this afternoon, if you are lost, that's a terrible condition to be in. A person who's lost is headed for an eternity away from God. Headed for an eternity of torment. That's where the lost are. Heading for torment. If you are one of those, you can get right with God even as you make up your mind, I want to do what the Lord said. I want to be associated with him. I want to live forever with him. And you can. If you know what to do, we invite you as we stand together to sing.